Encounter Talks with Dawn at Gessner Ministries, a forum for discussing challenging topics, dissecting truth, discovering hope and light in a world that desperately needs revival.
The message that you preached on Wednesday, Wes, was a salvation message. And I have called my Encounter Talks today, the power of our influence. And the reason that I wanted to talk about that is everybody has their own takeaway from a message. You know, you have 10 people listening or watching a message. We all have different thoughts that sort of grab us. And the one that grabbed me was the thought of Paul and Silas there in the prison. And when they had the opportunity to just flee from the prison, they chose not to. And the truth is, I think that they probably had a number of legitimate reasons that they could have thought about that would have given them permission in their own minds to actually flee the prison, but they didn't. And so for me, the takeaway from that message was the power of our influence. And I've thought about so many people that have influenced my life. And then you can narrow that down to 2 or 3 that had the biggest influence. And it just made me realize that how important it is for how we live on a very regular basis. It's not about Sunday church only, but it's every moment of our lives, because we're in contact with people all the time and we have an influence that makes the difference. So for me, that was the takeaway. I know at some point in the message near the end, you said about the hunger for God and the influence that those you have around, or the influence you have because of those around you, that influence you rather. So you if you want to give us the summary of your message, and we can look at the various points. But for me, that was the big takeaway. Even though I know it's a salvation message, but it's we're influencing people towards salvation every day. So that was the power of that message for me.
Well, and I think the points were just the points of a sermon for me are as much for me as they are for anybody else, just to keep me on track. So of what I'm trying to communicate. So I don't even have those in front of me today. I think the biggest thing for me with that message, what's a story I've heard all my life, Paul and Silas in jail. It's pretty exciting as a kid to hear all that. And you kind of picture what you see in your mind, what you saw in a picture Bible, just whatever. As an adult, when I process that, I read things like how severe their wounds were, that they were beaten severely. And then you process that into their wounds were not even touched until after the earthquake, and the man then treated them. So they were thrown into the prison. Those prisons were the floors were lined with straw or whatever, dirt, grime, rats. They were in stocks on top of that, bound. I mean, that's pretty serious. It's a pretty serious punishment. And then for them to be singing hymns at midnight, I don't think they were doing that so that they could put it on their resume. I think they were doing it because they loved God, and that's who they turned to in that very, very desperate hour.
Well, I don't even think that it would have been possible for them to do that without having that love of Christ inside, because humanly we don't have that kind of tenacity, I don't think.
Right, and most of us have never, ever faced anything like that. If we get a flat tire on the way to church, we blame the devil and kind of feel like we're being persecuted. But it's not, in comparison to these early Christians and leaders and what God, Jesus called these people and said, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be rough. But in that roughness and in those challenges that seem horrible to us, they spread the gospel. They shared. It was it was winsome. And I think even when, I've heard stories that when Christians were dying in the Colosseum, how many people would turn to the Lord because of their faith in that moment. And again, I read that and I hear it. I'm like, man, there's got to be better ways to share the message of salvation. But on the other hand, we serve a Jesus who said, pick up your cross, and whatever that may mean on any given day, it's that consistently picking up our cross and following him that leads others to see, wow, so there is something different about you. There's something, you're part of this world, but you're really not part of this world. You don't get sidetracked by the issues. You're sort of, there's an old song, I think Keith Green wrote it, about my head is pledged to heaven. That was back from the 70s or 80s. But I think our life becomes so winsome to people when we really are focused, and it does lead to salvation.
Yeah.
Leads others to salvation.
Yeah, and it just makes you realize how serious we need to take our lives and how we live our lives out. There's probably a lot of things in our lives that we can choose to do, but it may be that even though it's okay, it may not have the impact that we could have if we chose something else.
Right.
Yeah.
I go back, Don. I was thinking, I overheard my wife listening to a podcast a couple days ago, and the woman that was speaking I really have a lot of respect for her and think that her messages are just tremendous. And she was making the point, and it took me back. I know for a lot of Christians, this seems crazy now, and it seems like, and I don't want to get into politics, but it seems mild now by comparison. But I remember when Bill Clinton first got elected, and Christians in certain circles, at least evangelical circles, were like almost in shock and didn't know how to handle it. And I remember I was preaching in churches all around the country at that time, and I used to have a message that talked about the people in the Psalms, the singers of Israel who hung their harps on a willow and couldn't sing the Lord's song in a strange land. And then at the same time, you had Daniel and the three Hebrew children, same captivity, who found the courage and a way to function within the heart of the palace, within the heart of Daniel. Worked for 5 incredibly ungodly kings, and he never lost his faith. He never lost his convictions. He stayed true to God, and it was, you find these ungodly kings praising God because of Daniel's faith. So that's always been the model that I like. And I think that this lady made the point, we're not the home team anymore. And in America, Christians have been so used to sort of, if you hear anybody make a reference to faith, it was always about Christianity.
Yeah.
Well, that respect has been gone for a decade or more, for sure. And I don't know that church people know that all the time. I think people still live under the delusion that somehow Christianity is, and I think, hopefully, my prayer has been that God will shake us to help us realize what we don't even know that's going on. And if you really, I don't want to get down into this too far, but if you start really looking at the stats of how many people are coming to Christ through the influence of the church, it is heartbreaking and should shake us to our core. And I pray for that. I pray for that conviction in my own life. I pray, we are called to be light and salt and to have an influence on the world rather than be influenced by the world. And I think that time's coming. And I think Paul and Silas' story is that. It's because of their consistency, because of their love for God, because of their faithfulness, this man and his family came to Christ in a very dramatic way.
Yeah. And I can't help but think, for us, a lot of times the way that we process, I think, as far as church is concerned, it's how can we relate to the world, because we want to be able to have an impact, when I believe a lot of times the world is not looking for us to be the same. They want something different than what they are now. So that's an important part of my process of looking at it. But Wes, just from a contemporary standpoint, who's one or two individuals, and you may or may not want to name them, but identify the influence that you've had from others in your life?
I mean, are you talking currently or are you talking historically?
Well, I don't want to go back 100 years ago. I'm
not that old, but
I'm just talking about in your adult life.
Probably the thing I miss right now more than anything else, there were a few older men who probably were 20 years older than me.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout my ministerial life, they were always there. I knew I could call them and seek their counsel, seek their wisdom, seek their companionship in the faith. And I won't name those names at this point, but I can tell you one was a name that you'll know, and that's J.D. Young. For me, long after we were not necessarily traveling in the same circles, until his dying day, he kept an interest in my work and in my faith, and that was a huge loss for me. And but there have been other people. It's interesting now because I think I find myself making the transition into that age where I guess instead of looking for somebody to be that person, I'm supposed to be that person and turn around to people behind me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of an interesting transition.
Yeah.
At 60, I don't know that I'm ready to be a venerable sage. But God's opened a door just even recently for me to do ministry with a 36-year-old we are incredibly different people when we approach the scripture, when we approach our delivery, we approach everything different, and yet our heart really beats on a lot of the same beats and the same passion. The pastor of the church that I've attended for the last 6 years plus is again somebody that's younger. We don't think alike on some things, but there's enough of a shared vision and a shared mission. And I love going to lunch with him. And I guess I've kind of become that person for other people that are younger. So that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
There certainly were some men and even women in my life. I can remember going to a camp meeting as a kid where a woman missionary was preaching, and I'm not able to recall her name. I need to call one of my sisters and ask. But I remember going to the altar under that powerful word that was preached, and those people were like just I'm sure they weren't perfect, but they were like heroes to me because of their willingness to be used by God.
Yeah.
To stand in front of other people and to share the gospel.
Yeah. I wonder if there's anything to this, because not too many days ago, I had someone who they wanted to share their appreciation for myself. And when they finished, I honestly was surprised. I guess that's the best way to say it, because I didn't even see myself as they were seeing myself. And that's a little bit intriguing in one sense of the word, but
yeah.
The influence of an individual in my life, even though while I had some peripheral contact with that person, but it was more from a distance. It was Steve Green, who is, in that time he was considered a contemporary singer. Back in the 80s, maybe. But I just always thought that every time that he sang, it was so much more than just performance from him. You just felt the passion for what his purpose was.
I was part of that with you when you sponsored him at a concert in Williamsport, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And I remember eating dinner with his family and you and before the concert, and then I sat there in total amazement because of the depth of his faith. And I remember telling you, and you won't remember this, but I said, I feel like in the last 2 hours, I just sat through 2 revivals and a camp meeting all in one night.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was the depth of spiritual transformation that he was translating to other people. That's probably not the right way to say it, but his faith and again, just amazing. So
yeah,
consistent, just everything about him. So I can relate to what you're saying there. That's certainly a good one.
Yeah, it has been an inspiration for our own ministry that, make sure that our purpose for what we do is always forefront, and it's not about us. But, well, I know the message was a salvation message, but the most intriguing part was the power of our influence, because we're influencing people either towards salvation or asking them to, be everything that God possibly can do in their lives to be that person. And it's an important part that we play in that transformational part of living life.
I think I mentioned this, and I will just say this as probably you're ready to wrap up here, but the Apostle Paul, went to jail later in Rome and was imprisoned for his preaching. And while he was there, he wrote letters to the churches. And so I didn't share as much as I had actually in my message the other day from Philippians, but I'm absolutely convinced that this jailer and his family were part of that church at Philippi that Paul left, established and left, and then wrote the letter of Philippians to.
Yeah.
And so I went back and read Philippians as though I were the jailer receiving this letter from the man who had brought Christ to me. And one of the things Paul says, and I think it's at the beginning of chapter 4, this is the love that he had for these people. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stay true to the Lord. I love you and long to see you, dear friends, for you are my joy and the crown I receive for my work. That speaks to me very powerfully. Do we have I want those kind of people in my life that I've brought to Christ and that they're the crown because they are now serving Christ. And so I think maybe I'm imagining too much, but I think the Philippian jailer and his family were part of that church and part of the paragraph.
Yeah. Well, it's an intriguing story, and like you said, it was a very attractive story to me as a kid growing up. Just the drama involved in it, but the power of that story to challenge us today to make sure that we are the right influence on others to bring them to God is so important. But thanks, Wes, for spending time today.
All right. Happy Friday. And
yeah, we'll see you next week.
I'm sure that you'll be golfing sometime, so I hope it goes well.
Well, thank you for that. It's always a fun time on the course,
Anybody wants to show you appreciation, they should buy you a round of golf. That's what
there you go. Yeah, thanks for that plug.
Yeah. All right. See you.
Thanks for watching. Take a moment to share with your friends.